So I have been the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church for the last 34 years. It's a long time, but it doesn't seem like I've only pastored this one church during that time period. It seems like maybe 3 churches because of the changes we've been to. The church is different at different stages here. When I went there 34 years ago, it was an older white congregation in a changing community, former steel town with no longer a steel mill. I was told at the time that we were the 3rd poorest community in the state of Pennsylvania. A recent seminary intern said, "Hey, you've moved up on that list, you're now 2nd. He said, "It's not a list you want to move up on." I was the first female pastor and the first pastor they had that was not full-time, at least in pay. And the people in the church told me later that they saw me as their last resort. They just wanted to keep the church open while they were still alive. In other words, they wanted me to stay and do their funerals so that the church would be open for their lifetime. But they forgot to tell me that when I went there. The presbytery staff person at the time was not happy that I was going there. He saw it as a not good fit. My background was in youth ministry. He said, "You know, there are no youth there." I said, "Well, there have to be youth somewhere in the community." Well, as a result, there were 5 youth in this church, all related. If you've done small church ministry, you know that route, all related. So we gathered them together, found another adult couple to help. Diane's here. She was one of the ones helping initially and throughout our ministry. And we said to those 5, bring 2 friends, and we'll just have a youth night, just to show you what this can be like. And they did. 15 kids showed, and that was our first youth group. So we had this older white congregation. We had this youth group that met on Sunday evenings. They didn't come to church on Sunday morning. Theirs was Sunday evening time. And that was how we were for the first few years. It was like doing kind of 2 ministries. And then it got to the point, probably about 7 years into this, that things were declining through attrition. The older generation was dying off. Money was leaving with that situation. So the session and I had a come to Jesus meeting. What is happening here? Where are we going? What are we going to do? What are our options? So I said, well, let's just brainstorm. Let's brainstorm and see what possibilities there may be for us. First item on the list, close the church. I thought, well, this is going well, I can see. Next item, merge with another church. Move, get out of this building and move possibly to another community. Last one out, turn out the lights. Let's just stay and do what we're doing until we can't do it anymore. And this list looked pretty dismal until one of the elders said, you know, God has us in this community at this time for a reason. If God wants our doors to close, they'll close. Let's go out doing ministry. It turned the whole tone of the meeting, and it turned the whole tone of our ministry. We stopped worrying about survival and got serious about community ministry. Now, I wish I could tell you that the session and I had this wonderful strategic plan that we followed. We did not. We had no idea what we were doing, nor could we have even imagined what God had in store for us, even if we thought we knew what we were doing. But we did 3 things. We added a meal at the end of every service. We have a fellowship time. We had donuts and cookies before that, and we decided to do a meal because conversation and relationship is deeper over a meal than a donut. And so we added a meal at the end of the services on Sunday, which gave a wonderful time for people to not only get to know each other, but it's great for pastoral care. I can do a lot of pastoral care in that hour, praying over people, hearing what's going on in their lives. And it connected us more to each other. The second thing we did was make a commitment to radical hospitality. We wanted everyone who walked through the door of that church to feel welcome. And it must have worked at some point, because some people have said, I walked in the first Sunday and felt like I was home. We said, we think that anyone who walks through the door of the church is evidence that the Holy Spirit is at work in some way in that person's life to bring them there, and we're going to honor that. We also added a prayer to our worship services. This came from one of the church revitalization programs that came along over the years. We've done them all. But the prayer goes like this: God, show us what you want us to do to be your people in this place at this time. We did these three things and then went on with our ministry. But the reality was we were often in the middle of something before God showed us that God was answering our prayer and guiding us in this. For example, we had some kids at our youth group complaining there were no jobs in our community for teenagers. So we started helping them start a chocolate making business. And for 10 years, it was Angel Treats, stood for always needing God's everlasting love. It was all their design. We were just the adult chaperones and guidance. For 10 years, they had a chocolate making business that created jobs for themselves and other youth in the community. And then they happened to grow up and go off into life. We have the lawn of our church, we have a 1/4 acre of lawn, and we had one member of church just wanted, in the worst way, to have garden planted in this. And she kept saying this, and finally she connected us with someone who connected us with Grow Pittsburgh. Grow Pittsburgh came out and almost salivated because they do urban farming to see this land. Within 2 weeks, our grant was approved, and we have a community garden on our church property that was totally paid for, designed, and directed by Grow Pittsburgh. And I remember saying to them, we don't have enough members who garden to do a community garden. They said, no, it's a community garden. You open it up to the community. And what I found is that people who garden really garden. I mean, they love gardening. And so we did a canvassing of the community. 36 people have garden beds in our garden, mostly from the community. And they are there all the time. Middle of winter, they're out there standing there looking at the ground. I say to them, it's winter, nothing is happening. And at one point, our manse was not being used for anything, and people kept donating items for the yearly flea market we had. And people's, mom would die, they had to clean out the house, and they would bring the stuff and say, could we store it? We know the flea market's 6 months away, can we store this stuff? And so at one point, one of the elders came to me and said, the house is full of stuff. We can't take any more stuff. I said, why don't we just open the doors and let the community take this stuff? And that started our Shared Blessings mission store, where people donate household items, kitchen items, baby items, children's clothing. They donate for free, we give it away for free in our Shared Blessings mission store. The Greater Pittsburgh Food Bank came to us and said, we need someone to distribute the senior food boxes to income qualifying seniors. Sure, why not? We have a parking lot. The personal care home next door has become a part of our ministry as well. We sponsor the Imagination Library for our zip code. We have a Matthew 25 fund that helps those in need among us. And we have a growing refugee population in Duquesne now from Afghanistan and Syria. And most of them are Muslims. So that has been a new kind of ministry in welcoming them into the mission store, having ESL class at our church, and having activities where we just get to know them as neighbors, and to give their children an opportunity to play and have fun in a safe way, because they live in a housing project above the church, and we have a large social room. None of these things we could have envisioned happening, even if we had a visioning process that we went through. We couldn't have imagined any of this. They came to us as an answer to our prayer, and we simply said yes. None of these things are we able to do on our own. We have partnerships everywhere. John McMillan Church has been a partner church for us, helping us with our community children's program for 27 years. And they support our missions store. Our Jefferson UP pastors who are here help us with our vacation Bible school each year. Of course, Grow Pittsburgh was a partner. We have partners in the community and churches everywhere, because we couldn't possibly do what we do on our own. We're still a smaller congregation. Our average worship is 45, but there is an amazing diversity in this group of age, of race, of abilities, of socioeconomic, sexual orientation. There is no other reason I could imagine that this group of people would gather for any other reason than what we do on Sunday mornings. And I always see it like a slice of the kingdom of God every Sunday. I feel, however, like I have three congregations: those who worship in the sanctuary, those who meet Wednesday night at garden night, and those who are over at the store, the mission store, that help and attend. In fact, a lot of the mission store volunteers are community people. And I made them honorary Presbyterians last year, because not only do they help there, but if we have an event at the church, they're helpers. They're over there helping. And our ministries are now all intertwined, and we've gotten to know one another, and people come in and participate as they feel comfortable. So after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, the disciples must have asked themselves, what now? What do we do while we're waiting for God to guide us into the future? Will this movement survive? Even after the coming of the Holy Spirit, they could not have imagined what God had in store for them. But what they did do in the waiting for God to guide them, they gathered together, shared all things in common, eating together, praying, being who they were called to be, and they lived out their faith in the world. The early church grew as people saw them living out their faith of care for each other and those in need. Who are these people, they asked. The early Christians were known for their radical charity, strong community bonds, and distinctive moral behavior in the Roman world, particularly by caring for the poor, the abandoned, and the sick, even during the plagues. They were recognized for holding egalitarian views that treated slaves and women as equals, acting as a counterculture that emphasized forgiveness over vengeance. We are in a changing time for the church. The church as we know it is declining. Some say the church, at least in our part of the world, is dying. And we certainly live in a difficult time in our world. But maybe, just maybe, God is doing a new thing here, or maybe more accurately, getting us back to our roots of faith, in ways that we can't yet fully imagine. There's good news and there's bad news for the church in our time and in our society. The bad news is the church is changing, and it is not the church that we once knew. The good news is the church is changing, and we get to be part of it. From my point of ministry, God seems to be calling us to two things: to provide opportunities for people to experience God in community, and to provide avenues for people to live out their faith in the world. Financially, Duquesne is still on the edge of existing. We had a session meeting last week. Everything's going well, except the finances. We're still hoping to survive and not sure how this will work out, but we're trusting that God is going to do the rest as we keep doing ministry. In Isaiah, God says, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it?" Dear God, show us what you want us to do, to be your people in this time, in this place. Amen.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful part of the celebration to hear from our award winners. My name is Steve Crocco. I am on the Alumni Council. I'm the former library director here. And as one of the students who saw my name tag said, "Oh, you're the Ancient of Days." Does anybody, I graduated in 1978. Anybody earlier than that here? All right, way to go. Okay, we're going to hear from our award winners. Each person will have 15 minutes, and we're going to save your questions for the end. All right, and we'll have questions. I'd like you to come up to use one of the microphones. Okay, Dan, you're going to go first.
Okay, so Professor Daniel Frayer-Griggs, 08. He's an assistant professor of biblical exegesis here, with whom I took Greek, I highly recommend, and director of the Center for Writing and Learning Support here at the seminary, where, disclaimer, I work for him, but he's a great boss. He's a New Testament scholar specializing in the Gospel of John, apocalyptic literature, intertextuality, and illness and healing in the Bible. He's published works in multiple places, including 2 books, Saved Through Fire, an examination of the references to flames in the New Testament, and he is also co-editor of To Recover What Has Been Lost. He has been, in my seminary learning career, an amazing combination of faith, kindness, and intellectual rigor. I could not say anything better.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Becky, for that nice introduction. Appreciate it deeply and feel mutually. As Becky said, my name is Dan Frayer-Griggs, and I graduated from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in 2008. I came here for the Master of Arts degree, which we now call the Master of Theological Studies, and was therefore finished in 2 years. So I came in 2006, and if you had told the 2006 me that I'd be here 20 years later, I'd be completely shocked, and if you told the 2006 me that I'd be teaching here, I'd be even more so. It's a great honor and a privilege and joy to teach here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. As Becky introduced, my role is twofold. I both teach on the faculty. I teach biblical exegesis and some Bible classes. I teach Greek and research methods, but I also direct the Center for Writing and Learning Support. The Center for Writing and Learning Support, also known as the Writing Center, because that's quite a mouthful, was established in 2017 by founding director Shan Overton. And shortly thereafter, Shan invited me in 2018 to join as on the writing center staff, as a writing consultant, and that was a great godsend for me at that time. I was finishing up a visiting position at Duquesne University and was looking for continued work, and if you are not familiar with the academic job market out there, it is brutal. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me to come here to start work at the seminary, and as I worked here, doors continued to open. I began teaching first as an adjunct, then as a visiting assistant professor. Then Shan moved to help her family out in Tennessee, and I became interim director of the Writing Center, and then all of that led to a faculty appointment and director of the Writing Center. And I couldn't have planned that. It worked out much better than I would have tried to plan it. And so it's a great privilege to work here. I have wonderful colleagues, some of whom are here, and lots of great support. So there's a lot more I could say about the Writing Center, but since my award is for academics, I wanted to share with you some of my own research. In my teaching, I teach some classes that are concerned with what we might consider contextual reading of Scripture, so a course on the Bible and disability, for instance, a class on Bible and ecology, but my research and my scholarly passions, I suppose, are very historical in orientation. And so what I'm going to share today is a little bit of that sort of exegesis that I do teach in the classroom, in the Greek and exegetical classes, but also what motivates me personally in my own research. And so I don't have a slideshow, but I've got a PDF that I'm going to share some information up on the screen, a lot of texts from some primary sources. And the topic I've chosen to talk about has to do with the healing of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus in John 11. Partly because I just finished working on this project, and so it's forefront in my mind. I'm also teaching a class on the Gospel of John, so I got to share some of this material with them last week as we were covering chapter 11 in John's Gospel, but it also fits well with the theme here of restoration, right? We have the restoration of life in the story of Lazarus. The text in question reads as this: Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had been dead came out, his feet and hands bound with linen strips and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let them go." And I've tweaked the NRSV translation a little bit. You might expect to hear "unbind him and let him go." This is a more literal translation. If you took Greek, you might remember the paradigms you learned all have the verb luo as the guiding verb. It means to loose. And it does show up in some interesting contexts that I'd like to explore today. But first I want to note that if you pick up a commentary or multiple commentaries and you read the passage on chapter 11, verses 43 and 44, you're going to see two repeated sorts of observations or two repeated sorts of claims. One of them is a lot of people start wondering about how was Lazarus walking, right? If his hands and feet are bound, it starts to be difficult to interpret that on a very literal level. Some have imagined him sort of miraculously gliding out of the grave. Others have suggested he was hopping out of the grave, which sounds quite ridiculous. And some do try to suggest that, well, maybe they were very loose bindings and he was able to shuffle his way out. That's reading more into the text than is there. And it also doesn't reckon with the fact that tombs actually had very small, low openings. And so again, it starts to look a little bit ridiculous if you're imagining Lazarus kind of worming his way out of the tomb. And so I'm suggesting that maybe we should think of a more symbolic reading of this text. And there's another reason for that, is that in all of the remaining records of burial of ancient Judaism, there's no evidence that ancient Jews bound the hands and feet of the corpses. And so that's also an odd feature. And you'll see, that's the other comment you'll see again and again in the commentaries, that there's no historical, literary, or archaeological evidence that this was indeed a practice. And so that's another sort of curiosity. And so what I want to bring your attention to is that there is a huge body of literature that uses this image of bound hands and feet, both in the Bible and in some of the literature surrounding the Bible. And for me, this is what excites me in my interpretation of the text, is when you come up against something that is strange or curious and doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, and then you look at it in the context of its historical origin, its literary and historical cultural context, and some of that light starts to illuminate the text. And I think this is a case where that can happen. So, first text, and apologies to those who can't see it over here, is from 1 Enoch. 1 Enoch was a very popular book in ancient Judaism, and in fact gets quoted in the book of Jude, and so it was very influential among some Christians as well. This text says, "Go, Raphael, and bind Asael hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the wilderness that is in Dudael. There cast him, and lay beneath him sharp stones and jagged stones, and cover him with darkness, and let him dwell there forever. Cover up his face, and let him not see the light, and on the day of the great judgment, he will be led away to the burning conflagration." So in this text, there's actually a lot of interesting links to the Lazarus story. There's a burial of some sort involving rocks or stones. There's this light and darkness motif that runs through the Lazarus story as well. There's this reference to covering the face. And so these intrigue me. I'm not sure what exactly to do with those. And I'm not suggesting here that John was copying 1 Enoch and using that as a literary source. What I want to suggest, rather, is that there's a cultural symbolism at play in both of these that would have been familiar to other readers. I'm going to skip over two of these texts because they're basically just repeats from 1 Enoch of the same scenario. These might sound more familiar to you. One of them comes from the Gospel of Matthew, the story of Jesus' parable of the wedding banquet. And in Matthew's version, just in Matthew's version, at the end of that text, there's a guy who shows up and he's not wearing the right clothes. He doesn't have his garment on, his wedding garment. And so it says, the man without the wedding garment was speechless. That verb could also be translated muzzled or silenced, which is interesting in light of some of the other things we'll see here. Then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot, and throw him or cast him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." An uncomfortable text, a strange text, but again, we see this motif of the bound hands and feet and some other interesting similarities I'll draw your attention to or ask if you're noticing anything after I read one more text. This is from Mark, the Gospel of Mark, the story of the Gerasene demoniac. "And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him." The verb bind is in here, but we don't see the words hand and foot. What we see instead are shackles and chains, and those are actually, it could be translated handcuffs and fetters, right? So they're like around his wrists and around his ankles. So again, I think there's a continuation of this motif here. And I have a number of other texts that establish this motif, but I'm curious if there's any common threads that you see running through any of these besides the obvious of the bound hands and feet. We have Raphael binding Azael hand and foot. We have a demoniac who is bound hand and foot, and we have this guy who's cast into Gehenna who is bound hand and foot. One thing that strikes me is that these all have something to do with like a spiritual struggle of some sort, right? There's heavenly powers, angels, there's demonic powers, the demons, and in some cases, the reference to Gehenna. And so this is striking to me as I start to look at some of these other texts as well. I don't have time to talk about all of the texts here. In fact, if someone could let me know as I'm approaching time, that would be helpful. But one sort of tradition it's known as the katabasis, a descent into the underworld. And there's one particular text I'll draw attention to here because it's a really interesting interpretation of the story of Lazarus. The author of this text, in a section previous to this quotation, is talking about how Lazarus was in the underworld and a voice called him out and snatched him out from their midst. And it concludes with Jesus coming down into Hades, and it says, "The King of Glory seized the chief ruler, Satan, by the head, and handed him over to the angels and said, 'Bind his hands and feet and neck and mouth with iron.'" So again, another instance of this motif of bound hands and feet. And again, it's in this context of spiritual struggle of some sort. Well, there are a lot of other texts I could point to. One is from several from these Greek binding spells and some from some Jewish incantation bowls, but I don't want to speak too long. And so what I wanted to do is sort of situate this in some other scholarship on the Gospel of John. There's a scholar named Judith who wrote an article that suggests that John's Gospel should be read as a sort of cosmic combat story. That is, we see the dualisms between light and darkness, good and evil, day and night, and that's a running theme through a lot of apocalyptic literature. It also shows up in John, and it takes place in a central spot in Kovacs' interpretation in John 12, 31 and 30 through 33, which is quoted here. "Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." He said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die. And so for Kovacs, this combat motif culminates here as Jesus is talking about his death, his crucifixion, his resurrection, as a sort of exorcism of Satan from the world. And so all these themes of exorcism run through these texts that I've drawn our attention to. And I'm thinking that maybe in the story of Lazarus, which foreshadows in a lot of ways the raising of Jesus, the burial, death, and raising of Jesus, that we can see a prefiguring of this sort of cosmic exorcism in this binding and loosing language in the story about Lazarus. And so here's an instance where I think we have a curiosity of the text that is really troubling if we tried to imagine it on a literal level. But once we examine some of the broader symbolism within the context of the Gospel of John, or around the context of the Gospel of John, some of those strange features start to make a little more sense, at least they do to me. And so I think that's a good illustration of the sort of research that I like to do outside of my teaching and my work here at the Writing Center. I got the 1 minute just a moment ago, so I will conclude there. Thank you all.
And so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Dr. Renee Mikell, PTS class of 2010. And I am a United Methodist in full connection with the United Methodist Church. I'm an elder. I've served nearly 20 years in pastoral and extension ministry, and occasionally in missional service to God. And so I think that is why I was offered this opportunity to share some of my missional ministry experiences with you. Of course, I'm grateful to the Alumni Board and to Dr. Craston and Dr. Asa. I'm grateful to all of you for your time. And so, let me simply say, I'm grateful for everyone. I'm grateful for everyone that God has placed in my path, in my life. And I'm grateful because no one achieves anything of meaning alone. It truly does take a village. And so for the next few minutes, I'll share the blessing of participating in God's global and local mission in the world. And I will describe 6 of my missional experiences. I lost track and never really realized that there were 6. So I'm excited to share some of that with you. So my missional experiences have been in Nigeria, in Egypt, in Puerto Rico, in Fiji, and in Zimbabwe.
So I won't present from the slides. The slides are just for context, and they'll be a continuous loop. And somewhere along the way in these 15 minutes, you'll probably recognize some of what I'm sharing with you today. So the presentation is entitled Transformational Mission and Inspirational Learning. And I chose to entitle it Transformational Mission because mission is transformative. And one of the things that I have also discovered is, as it relates to inspirational learning, God's presence is evident, has been evident in all of the missional assignments that I found myself with. And so these will be for context. And as I move through the slides, I will approach it from this perspective. I'll name the location of the mission, I'll describe the mission experience, and I'll share a little bit about how the mission has impacted me. So before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about mission in itself, just in a practical sense. Because I think sometimes the term mission or missionary is a loaded term. And sometimes I think that we may have missed the mark a bit in our approach. One of the reasons I think that is because mission is not ministry to people, cultures, or nations. It's not territorial, it's not political, it's not technological or industrial advances. Ministry is mission that honors God. It's not an imposition of values, it's a collaboration. It's a partnership. It's a partnership between God and God's Spirit and God's people for the greater good. And the goal, I believe, for sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And so one of the things that I've learned along the way in our annual conferences, collaboration with Zimbabwe, is that the Zimbabwean people, our brothers and sisters in Zimbabwe, define faithful mission as Chabazda. Chabazda spelled Chabazda. And it's a Shona term that describes someone is working in the field when another person comes along to assist in a spirit of helping one another who is already at work. Assisting people we encounter gives us a level playing field. So we don't have ourselves coming to rescue someone. We acknowledge that work has already been done or beginning to happen ahead of time. And our role is to come alongside and to help them. And when we do that, that person becomes part of the we. I've discovered that when we are helping them, we learn how to see each other as God sees all of us as human beings. So I'll begin with Nigeria. The first slide you'll probably notice, and I don't have many pictures, but you'll probably notice from that slide when it loops back around that there are, it seems like nearly 100 children in a sanctuary in green uniforms. So those children were, part of our mission was to deliver school supplies to that particular congregation and those children. Now this particular mission was spearheaded by my senior pastor in Atlanta. She was invited to come to Port Harcourt, Nigeria in 2007 to preach during their time of revival. And what happened in that particular experience was a multi-generational ministry. And so we ministered to the children through supplies. We ministered to the young people through a workshop. We ministered to the women through a workshop. And eventually it led to the revival in River State, which was actually outside, preaching. What I learned, what I experienced was a group of people who were radically hospitable. And so to the extent that a seamstress could be sitting in the space and never ask, what your size is, but not magically, but for the use of another word, but she would come up with a dress or a shirt or something to present to us as we were leaving. This was my first mission outside of the country. And so there were many things that were shocking, to look in the face of a 7-year-old child who's standing in City Square begging for food for a 4-year-old child. However, what I also discovered was that even though they had the least to offer, they offered the best of what they could offer. And they offered it according to our values in the United States. So clean water, bottle unopened, clean juice, bottle unopened, the best food. And, it's humbling because you go through a room to sit and the family is sitting to the side having offered whatever food they have and waiting for us to consume the food before they eat, if they eat. And so it was just very humbling. What I learned about myself was the heartbreak of seeing hunger in the children's eyes. I learned that how to truly love a stranger, love your neighbor as yourself. I learned that we came bearing tangible gifts out of our abundance, and they graciously offered valuable intangibles of hospitality, selflessness, care, and Christian witness. So I'll talk a little bit now about Egypt. The Egypt trip that I was blessed to conduct ministry was actually part of the Pittsburgh Seminary VIM, I think it's VIM Volunteers in Mission, or maybe I'm thinking about a Methodist term, I'm sorry. But it was a missional opportunity from the seminary. And we traveled with our professor, our missiology professor, Dr. Sundquist. And our mission was to the seminarians at Cairo Theological Seminary. We were tasked with taking 2 suitcases, which for me was a shock, and one of which was for your personal belongings, and the other was to be filled with books so that we could stock the seminary library. And it was very humbling because when you think about our seminary library, it's such a blessing. I remember having a carrel on the bottom floor for study. I remember the volumes of books and everything that we associate with our library, our abundant library here, only to arrive and know that we were stocking one room with sparse amount of books on the shelves. And so that was our mission. Also, we lived with the seminary students. We lived on campus, and they took us around the town. They showed us various things. They answered various questions. We also encountered with some of the seminarians that we were staying with the persecution of one of the Christian churches. What I learned was, and what I experienced was, being in a country where Christianity is at this point 10 to 15%, and then it was less. And so I learned to wake up to morning prayers. I learned to, and I'll say that our seminary professor did a great job of helping us to understand the importance of not trying to proselytize anyone, but to just lay low and, not find yourself in prison. One of the experiences that will always be with me is the cave church. And so in Cairo, if a Christian wants to build a church, they have to put an application in to construct a new church. And so as the Christian faith is growing, there was not much opportunity for Christian churches in the area. But there was a cave church that was sort of like an amphitheater. And because of the illiteracy rate, the entire gospel was carved out on the cave. It was absolutely beautiful. And so you enter into the cave, and there was a very powerful ministry that took place that I'll never forget. I'll move on. If I want to get through 5, I think I need to move on. But I really do value. Zimbabwe was next. And so I visited Zimbabwe 3 times. The first was an immersion where I lived with a 4th grade teacher and her son. And my mission was actually for us to, as it relates to our churches in America, to learn a little more about how they conduct themselves for discipleship. You know, we were having fewer and fewer baptisms and, you know, all the things that we have grown to experience in the church, only to find that they were growing and growing. And so I lived with her for 6 weeks and learned about the discipleship, and I'll move on. I also visited in 2017, and that was part of the Shabasta experience, where I came not as an individual, but I came as a representative along with the bishop to meet with their bishop and learn a little bit more about how our programs were progressing, digging wells, building buildings, supporting the clinics. And then again in 2019 to Africa University, where we came to learn alongside and teach alongside the lay and clergy there. I think I may be down to 1 minute. So I'll mention that I also had mission to Fiji. And that was an opportunity for us to clear out spaces in the men's dorm, paint, scrub floors, scrub walls, scrub ceilings. And we had people who had the talent to install solar panels. And so we definitely left the place better than we found it. Puerto Rico was all about hurricane support, which, you know, the United States had not gotten around to helping Puerto Ricans, but we went, and I remember my brother being terrified when he saw a picture of me on a roof, sandblasting and cleaning the roof. And I think I may be out of time at this point, so if you have questions about the local mission, I'll be happy to answer. And thank you for your time and attention.
My name is Mikell Snyder, so good to be with you. I am, I believe, class of 2005. Is that what we are? Yeah, okay. And Pittsburgh Seminary has been really central to my journey. I met my husband here. I came when I was 26. I didn't want to be a pastor. I just wanted to figure out some stuff about God. I was super confused, and so thought seminary would be a good place to do that. My husband says that I'm the only person he knows who came to seminary with questions and left with answers. So here I am. But yeah, I met my husband here. My first daughter was born when I was a student here. We lived in the apartments over there. And as I look around this room, I know many of you from so many places, from fellow graduate to intersecting in Pittsburgh Presbytery to people I've taught boundaries trainings for. I was a dual degree student, so I ended up a therapist. Some people, I won't make eye contact, I've seen for therapy who are in this room. I was the therapist here on campus, directed the Pittsburgh Pastoral Institute, and it's not lost on me, actually. The reason I'm in front of you is none of those reasons. The reason I'm in front of you is because I am the co-founder and co-director of the Global Leader in Faith-Based Suicide Prevention Training. The name of the organization is called Soul Shop. We've been around since 2014, and one of our very first Soul Shops, actually, in maybe 2015, was in this room. Were you at that, Sharon? Yeah. So super, super cool that I find myself back here to talk to you about Soul Shop in this capacity. People sometimes ask, like, how does one become the global leader in faith-based suicide prevention? And my answer is like meanderingly. That's how you become that. And so to tell you the story of Soul Shop, I'll tell you the story of Soul Shop. And that is that in the early 90s, there was a Presbyterian pastor, not a PTS grad, but a Presbyterian pastor who was working at a large church in a small town in southern Ohio, when in one academic year, there were 3 suicides in that community. One in October, one in November, and one in April. And that'll just wreak havoc on a community, right? And so he looked around and he said, I kept saying, somebody needs to do something about this. And he said, then I remembered a dream that Pope John Paul had once, where he had a dream and he was like scandalized, whatever the dream was. And he said, I woke up and my first thought was, somebody needs to tell the Pope about this. And then my second thought was, oh shoot, I'm the Pope. And so he was like, I guess in this situation, I'm the Pope. I need to do something. And so he got trained in secular suicide prevention. This was the early 90s. And he said, I would go all over Southern Ohio and I would do these trainings. I'd fill fire halls and community centers and school auditoriums to talk to people about suicide. And we'd get 100 people there. There would be healthcare people and first responders and teachers and just you name it, parents, grandparents, like the gamut were in this room. But there never seemed to be any pastors. No pastors were showing up for this conversation. And he said, I started asking myself the question, what is it about the way that we're talking about this that isn't capturing the theological imagination of the church? And how do we change that? There's a suicidologist who once said that people die by suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to a loss of hope and a loss of social connection. And if the Church of Jesus Christ can't do something about hope and social connection, then it should probably just close its doors. And so with that conviction that suicide is primarily not about mental illness, but is primarily about isolation and despair, he realized that's actually what we do in the church. That's what we're good at. That's our bread and butter, is hope and connection. And so he, with that conviction, developed this one-day training, basically a one-day training, and he did it for one group of people, a group of Catholic priests in Cleveland, Ohio, and they loved it. And he thought, I think there's some real energy here. I think this is a conversation we're not having that we need to be having, and so we're going to do that. And so he did it again for another group of people, I think more Catholic priests, maybe still in Cleveland, I don't know. Anyway, and it went really well, and he said, I think this has potential. But he had a kind of a conviction and a program, but he didn't have any platforms. And he and I were friends because we were doing church consulting work together. And he said to me, I'll give this to you if you think you can take it and make it into a national movement. And so there's lots of ways to tell a story, but I would say fast forward 12 years, and lo and behold, we have. Early in the work, we got the attention of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, who said, since the early 90s, there's been a national strategy for suicide that said faith communities should be at this table, and nobody knows how to get them here. And so what we're seeing you do is get them in the room, and so we want to be your partner. And so we got the attention of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and that catapulted us into where we are today. Soul Shop has been done in 42 states and 4 countries. January of last year, we launched into West Africa, where we translated it into French. We've developed Soul Shop for Black churches, Hispanic churches, youth workers, campus ministry. We're currently working on a program through the National Episcopal Church on indigenous ministries, so Soul Shop for Indigenous Ministries. We have about 100 trainers in about 25 states and 4 countries. And so that's where we are. We're a global movement with national reach. So I'll just tell you a couple of the convictions of the Soul Shop movement. And that is that not only do churches belong in this conversation, but churches may be the only place that can really penetrate in communities. We believe that suicide is a public health crisis. And what that means is that we know that suicide is not primarily and predominantly an issue that's attached to a mental health diagnosis. Lots of people who think about suicide have mental health diagnoses, but it's not primarily that. We know that and that suicidality is ubiquitous. The estimates are that 6% of adults and 20% of adolescents are thinking about suicide at any given time. 6% of adults and 20% of adolescents. And that actually is a game-changing statistic for us in the church, because what it means is that in any congregation of 100 people, 6 of them, statistically reliably on average, are sitting there thinking about suicide. And that if you've got a youth group of 20 kids, statistically reliably on average, 4 or 5 of them are thinking about suicide. And so our question in the church is not whether or not we have people thinking about suicide. The question in the church is, who are the people here today who are thinking about suicide? Statistically, reliably on average, there are people in this room today who are thinking about suicide. That's how common suicide is among us. And that means as people who gather, and who gather regularly and weekly in community, we are among those who are thinking about suicide. We also know that suicidality is based on many contributaries. That's kind of how we talk about it. That suicide itself is not a disease, but it is a complex intersection of multiple factors that all converge at the same spot in a place where there's insufficient resilience to manage that. And so if suicide happens when distress overpowers resilience, what we have are people dealing with a myriad of things, and they don't have the resources or the infrastructure to manage that. Some of those are internal. Oftentimes people have depression, are diagnosed with depression, but also they're often going through divorces. They're often dealing with financial issues. They're often dealing with shame around either, comparing themselves to the Joneses, or body dysmorphia, or gender and sexuality issues. People are dealing with all kinds of things that are driving this kind of despair, isolation, and hopelessness. And so you take that kind of those factoids, and then add to the fact that the mental health infrastructure in the United States is really insignificant. In Pennsylvania, 62% of communities lack sufficient access to mental health treatment to meet the needs of the people in those communities. In Ohio, 69% of communities lack sufficient access to mental health treatment to meet the needs of the people in them. In the state of North Carolina, 88% of communities lack sufficient access to mental health treatment to meet the needs of the people in them. So to the extent that there are mental health issues, many times in small towns, in small communities where suicide rates are highest, they're highest in rural communities, many times these communities lack sufficient access to mental health treatment to manage the situation. But every one of those communities has 1 or 2 or 7 churches. And to the extent that that's true, we've got these empty buildings 6 days a week that are underutilized in a world where people are literally dying by their own hand because of lack of external and internal resources. And so our conviction in Soul Shop is this question: what would it look like if the church could show up to bring their resources to this conversation? We, how long?
6 minutes.
Oh, serious, okay. 4 minutes, okay. Okay, great. I also do church consulting work. So I spent a lot of time in churches that are declining and aging with flip chart paper, trying to dream their way into a more vital future. And I had I heard a preacher once. It's like the only line in a sermon I've ever remembered for the long term. Don't tell my preacher husband. But he said, people are always looking for the will of God like it's a needle in a haystack. They're asking, what is the will of God? What is the will of God? What is the will of God? And what I want to say to them is, the will of God is the hay, and you're laying right in it. And that's how we feel about suicide in these congregations that are trying to find their mission and find their vision and figure out what we're doing here. We are literally surrounded by people who believe that the world would be better off without them. We are literally surrounded, inside and outside, by people who are in so much pain they believe that death would be the best option that they have. And so our vision, our master vision, is what would it look like if in congregations we could be the place where no one loses hope and no one is alone. I think I'll cede my 2 minutes. Okay, thanks.
All right, so first off, my name is Vinsel. I graduated from PTS back in 2015. I was the first person to actually graduate with the church planting track that PTS offers. And it was such a wonderful experience to be here at Pittsburgh, hanging out with some of the best church planters that our denomination has to offer. I always thought it was a little bit ironic. It's, having a track of how to disrupt the industry that you're in, coming from a place that's probably struggling with it more than anybody else. It's like going to Walmart and figuring out how to become the next Amazon. But that said, I really do feel like Pittsburgh did a fantastic job. And I loved getting to meet every single day with passionate other students who were thinking about what could the church be in the next century. We also, though, had clarity that 20 to 30 years from now, there may not be too many paid pastors. So I knew from the very beginning I was going to have to get a job somewhere else. And I went ahead and got a job with Cisco Systems, which is a tech company, and have enjoyed that a great deal. Now, as far as the church goes, though, I want to work for Cisco, but I want to volunteer in the church and do something really interesting, try to figure out what this next chapter might look like. And what we ended up doing is actually creating a robotics team, which is a little bit surprising for some people, but as I talk about the program, I think you're going to see that it fits pretty well with many of the values that we hold. Let me start out by talking about my ordination. We'll then move into robotics, how we got there, and then I want to talk about this sustainable funding model that I think many of our churches are struggling with, and we have a bit of a novel approach for that. So first off, for the ordination, again, working full-time for Cisco, I didn't think that this would be the problem, but the hardest obstacle was to actually get ordained. And the reason is, in order for you to get ordained in our tradition, you have to find a called and installed position, and most presbyteries have a minimum salary. And so you never would have thought this, but if you go to a presbytery and say, I want to work for free, it's a big problem. So we said, okay, look, I'm not going to work at the church because that would be a problem. I'm going to work beside the church. We're going to have a validated ministry doing outreach into the community. But then we have another theological problem, that as a pastor, I can't just do sacraments on my own, right? You have to have a council that authorizes it. So what council is possibly going to authorize my administration of sacraments? Well, that's easy, second pres. So I am not ordained into second pres, I'm beside second pres, but under the authority of second pres. And all of us look at it as, yeah, that was intellectual gymnastics, but we got there, it's okay. And I just want to call out that some people would look at that and say it's absurd, but I actually want to say how much I love that our denomination is able to do that, because we have real guardrails in place around ministry to prevent, honestly, pastors from being taken advantage of and not being paid anything. And yet at the same time, when we see a real calling, we find ways to make it work within our systems. And so here's just a list of some of the various councils from different sessions, the CPM, COM, from 2 different presbyteries, who all had to make this work and say, let's go ahead and do it. And again, to me, this is a huge success story of how our denomination really does work. And then for the ordination, though, we thought, I'm not being ordained into second pres, let's do it out in the community. So for the ordination service, we actually had it out in a park. And though a little bit theologically problematic, we had a hog roast. Let's just go ahead and have a hog. And it was wonderful. And we had about 250 people there. Only about 10% of the people were from the church. Everybody else was from outside in the community coming to this ordination service, which was a lot of fun. Now, as far as the new idea, we're looking for what sort of ministry we felt like we were being called to do within the community. And I had a little bit of an intuition here that number one, if a ministry is going to thrive, it has to be fun. If the kids don't enjoy it, they're not coming back and you're sunk. But the second piece that I don't think the church focuses on enough is that will it look good on a college resume? Because what ends up happening is even if the kid finds the opportunity fun, if the parents don't think it looks good on their college resume, guess what? They will absolutely have your kid be a part of it, but they're only going to come 5 times a year when they don't have soccer, swimming, chess club, and all the other activities. So we said, we're going to flip the script on this. We're going to have a program that those parents say, we're going to block out everything else and make sure that my kid's in this because this is what's going to look good on their college resume. So we ended up partnering with First Robotics, which is a national organization that is really, really cool. And that's why it's pretty easy to sell this program to kids and to families in the community, even those who aren't Christian, even those who don't care anything about our church. There's 2 basic levels. There's the first Lego League, so sort of think middle school youth group there, where it goes from 4th grade up to 8th grade, and then there's First Tech Challenge, FTC, which is 7th grade to 12th, basically think more high schooler kids. And just to give you a sense of scale and magnitude, there's the one here that says the FLL competition field, that's the one on your right, and they're literally using Legos. They're just taking Legos and piecing them together in order to build a robot, and Lego sells this little computer unit called a Spike Prime kit, and believe it or not, we have 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and even 70-year-olds who have never done anything with technology who can figure out Legos. It's true. It actually works, and they have fun doing it. And we do also have a bunch of younger professionals who are also helping out as well. And then when you get to the older kids, which is now on the left-hand side, that field's much, much bigger. So instead of 4 feet by 8 feet, we're now talking, I don't know, maybe that's 12 feet by 12 feet. And the robot's a bit bigger. And when you get to that level, we do need some folks with some more technical skill to help us out. Now, just want to talk again a little bit more about this program, just so you understand how this works. Only 1/4 of the points for these teams is how the robot performs, just 1/4. The other quarter is robot design, and this is where it's the most Presbyterian thing I've ever heard. They're like, we don't just care what decision you made, we care how you made the decision. What was the process you went through? And so they're gonna ask the kids, did you just simply vote? Whoever had the best idea? Did you create a rubric and then decide what are the different categories you were gonna weigh this decision on? And the kids have to articulate what their process was that they went through to design this robot and show them all the drafts. This is the ultimate way to prepare our kids to be on committees. It's fantastic. You also have core values where it's about cooperation. So not only are you helping other teams in the community, but you're obviously still competing. And they care a lot about that. And the last thing, which I actually think is the coolest, is the innovation project. Every year it's a new theme. One year it was space, another year it was transportation, another year it was underwater discovery. This most recent year was below Earth discovery. It was called Unearthed, trying to figure out what's below again, the soil. And so what they have to do is, number one, meet with a bunch of experts in the world today on that topic, and then identify a real-world problem that they're going to solve, define the problem, come up with a solution, and then go back to those experts they met with, pitch that idea to them, get feedback on why it's terrible, and then reiterate on it and come back with an even better solution. So our kids get to go around. We took a bus down to St. Louis. I'm in Illinois, and they got to see Cahokia Mounds. These kids get to actually go to a real archaeological dig. They got to learn and see a drone that created topographical maps. They got to learn about a World Heritage Site. They got to grade soil samples, use LiDAR. They even got to see how a laser scanner works and scan this bowl, and meet with a bunch of PhD and academics who are actually working for the State Archaeological Survey down in Southern Illinois. And then we turned around and we went up to Chicago, went the other way. And there they got to go to the Field Museum, learn about dinosaur DNA, learn about the dinos, actually meet some of the scientists who are cataloging all of this information for them. And again, just sort of soak in this whole ecosystem of people who are thinking about this general topic, and then again, define a problem, come up with a solution, and then go back to them. So I just love that, because really we as a church, that's what we're often doing. We're trying to figure out what is the problem, actually defining it, not just thinking the first thing we do is the best, but instead going around meeting with experts and coming up with different versions of that same ministry until we eventually are really doing it well. Here's some other things that the kids are learning. They are learning how to draw in CAD, which is basically where you design the robot on a computer before you actually build it. They're learning how to use 3D printers, which is pretty cool. They're learning how to code in Java. And then we also have youth leadership, which is, again, where this looks really good, both on their resume, but it's also just a meaningful program for these kids. You have kids leading it. You have kids calling up these different professors. 2 seasons ago, it was about underwater discovery. They actually called up an MIT professor and said, hey, I got a question for you. And he said, set up a Zoom meeting. And they got to meet with an MIT professor. They were interested in these underwater crabs off of Australia. So they called up a professor in Australia who said, sure, set up a Zoom meeting. I'll meet with you at 11 o'clock my time, which is 6 a.m. your time or whatever. And they talked to us about these giant underwater crabs. Super cool. And think about what the kid is now learning that they can do. They can literally call up random experts across the globe, and they'll take their call, and they can do something about it. That's what I want these kids to be learning in this program and in the church. And then here's a sample of one of the robots that they created. And again, the robot's almost an after the fact. And then they created a robot. As far as growth of the program, we started out with 5 youth and 2 volunteers. And just 4 years later, we're now at 86 youth, 27 volunteers, and we have 25 youth on a wait list who want to join the program, but currently aren't able to because we don't have enough seats available. But as fun as that is, this program's sounding kind of expensive. And guess what? It is. So if you're purchasing 28 of these Spike Prime kits at $500 a pop, you're spending about $5,000 to $10,000 a season on motors, driver hubs, gears. Biggest expense is laptops. If you want each of these kids pairing up, at our scale of 86 kids, you need 40 to 50 laptops. And at $1,000 a piece, wow, that adds up pretty quickly. And I don't have it listed on here, but we spend $400 a month on snacks. I didn't know how much Fritos cost until you have 86 kids coming in 3 times a week. It adds up. So in order to fund this, we had a little bit of an interesting model where we have, on one hand, Second Pres, but we also have 5i Robotics, which is our 501c3, and then there's First Robotics, which is the national organization. And the piece here that's really interesting is, number one, there's a shift happening with a lot of corporations, which I'll talk about here in a second, where they're actually wanting to give more money to nonprofits to make a good social impact. But 2, I think a lot of our churches, well, they first have pause, like, what do you mean you're getting corporate sponsorships for your church ministry? I want to trace this out, that there's actually a pretty strong precedent for this. So again, Second Pres can receive money, especially for anything religious. We have our 501c3, which gives us free Microsoft Office access, discounts on laptops. And then First Robotics allows us, we have corporate sponsorships from Cisco Systems, Microsoft, Caterpillar, and many other of these national organizations. And this is where when people are like, oh, really, can we do this? This seems a little different. I just want to remind us, how many of our Presbyterian churches have had a Boy Scout troop operating for the past 100 years out of our church? And those Boy Scout troops, by the way, very similarly, get money through the church. The church technically owns all the property, but they have their own checking account. They have their own autonomous finances there in the middle. And then they do get corporate sponsorships sometimes at the council level that then sends the money down to the individual troop. I mean, this is the exact same playbook that the Boy Scouts have literally been doing for 100 years in almost all of our churches. And then, of course, shout out to Mr. Rogers, who is also quite clever in his funding model. He had the Sears Roebuck Foundation from the beginning in 1968, donating a boatload of money. He also had member stations all across the country doing membership drives, and he was tax funded, which is always fun to think about. And many of us have seen that 1969 Senate hearing where he saved $20 million to keep it going to the CPB. And then the last piece I'll sort of bring up here real fast is the evolution of corporate giving. Don't want to overshare on this here, but before 1917, I find this kind of fun. It was illegal for a corporation to give to any nonprofit. Did you know that? It was illegal. Because if a board of directors decided to give profits to a charity, they were stealing from the shareholders. Illegal. And any shareholder could have sued that board and they would have won the battle. But something happened in 1935. FDR's like, look, there's a lot of need out there. The federal government can't pay for all of this. Let's soften that a little bit and let's give you a 5% tax break. So suddenly corporations are now able to give, but by and large don't yet. And it's not until 1953 that there's a court decision that finally gets rid of that principle that you're stealing from shareholders by giving to nonprofits. The last piece I'll say here is 1980s, corporations start viewing this as an opportunity to save their brand. So if they were in some scandal, This is marketing PR for them. They're going to give out a boatload of money to a bunch of nonprofits and advertise it to show how good of a company they are. But what's really happened since 2010, and this is where we need to also be aware of this, is the matching grant program. So what's happened is if you have an employee, instead of giving them $10,000 extra in salary that you pay taxes on and they pay taxes on, they say, look, I'll give you the $10,000, but to whatever charity you want. So now I, as the employee, am getting a benefit. I'm not paying for taxes on that. I get to still steer it, so it'll be a reason for me to stay in the company. And the company gets a tax break and gets to now advertise how many millions of dollars they've given and how many hours of volunteer time their employees have done. The problem is, of course, you can't just be a straight-up church. So this is where it's really important to have a 501c3 for that secular piece, and especially with a national organization like Scouts or First Robotics, where you can then tap into those national dollars. And I just want to point out that over the last 5 years, corporate giving has actually increased by 55%. That means almost, by 55%, the amount of dollars given by corporations has increased, and that's an important source for many of our churches to be able to take advantage of with adjacent organizations. And I was listening to you during chapel, giving a fantastic sermon, by the way, and discussing the many ministries that you have going on at your church. And I just thought 3 or 4 of those should be their own 501c3 that could then be getting the advantage of some of this national giving that's actually grown.
Okay, that's it. Thank you
you
very much. We have almost 15 minutes for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, I hope you all will. I have a microphone. You're welcome to use the microphone up front.
My one question is about suicide. I've come across a lot of great books giving and how to give counsel to people on suicide. But what about, and this is what I'm facing as even as a retired pastor, dealing with people who are the surviving member of the family of suicide. Could you help me?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways in which your question is the answer. The most significant thing is that you know they're there, you acknowledge that that's real, and you companion them, right? What we know is that about 1/3 of the population has been impacted in one way or another by loss to suicide. So a third of the people in this room can point to a place that they have had significant loss in some way. And people who have experienced suicide loss have pretty much higher risk for everything. Higher risk for suicide themselves, that's lifelong, that never goes away. Higher risk for divorce, higher risk for bankruptcy, higher risk for job loss, chronic pain, premature death. Like you name it, they have higher risk for it. And so the fact that we know they're there and then we find ways to surround them is really important. The other thing that suicide loss survivors will tell you is please don't hesitate to bring it up. When I meet a person who says that they've had lost a loved one to suicide, I immediately and always ask, what was their name and what did you love most about them? When a person dies by suicide, often they are remembered almost exclusively by the way that they died. And so it's sort of a black cloud that lives over their life. And so when we can honor the life of the person and not just kind of their death, it's really honoring. You can see a person light up. You say, what was your favorite thing about your son? And their whole demeanor changes and they smile. They don't get very many chances to experience joy about this person because it was such a black cloud. So I think that there are plenty of ways we can support them, but I think those are some of the most primary. Just acknowledging their loved one, continuing to ask them how they're doing, remembering birthdays, anniversaries, the anniversary of the person's death. I lost a cousin to suicide 8 years ago, and every single year on the anniversary of his death, I send a message to his family just saying, I'm thinking about you today. Maybe making sure those people aren't alone on those days, acknowledging the first of everything. So the first Christmas is going to be really hard. Their first birthday is going to be really hard. The anniversary of their birthday every single year. And we have seen, my co-director is back there on the couch. Wave, Chris. Yeah, so I keep looking at him when I'm talking. I have seen churches like basically do card showers that adopt these families. And so I will commit to sending a card every Thanksgiving. You commit to sending a card every birthday. And so we're just constantly surrounding them by that kind of love. And don't hesitate to ask them if they ever think about suicide, because they are at increased risk for suicide, and asking that question directly. My favorite way to ask it for that kind of a situation is, does it ever get so bad that sometimes you too think about suicide? And it gives them a chance to name the pain. So yeah, it's a good point, thank you. When we talk about the four faces of in congregations, what does it look like to do this ministry? You're dealing with people who are thinking about suicide, those who have lost someone, those who are worried about a loved one, and those who have their own lived experience of suicidality, who we say in every church in America, you've got people thinking about suicide sitting right beside people who have been suicidal in the past and have found ways to live. And if we could get those two people talking to each other, we could change this conversation. So
Another question.
yeah.
Just to pick up on what you were saying there, my first thought goes to the spousal survivor. But there's children of different ages. They could be elementary, they could be college students or young adults. But how do you follow up with those beyond the spouse?
I would say the answer is exactly the same. I mean, I just talked to somebody at a church last week, and he said, my father died by suicide when I was 7. And I said to him, what was his name? What did you love most about him? And so I think it's the same. And that person still has lifelong risk for suicide. So, yeah.
Okay, another question.
This is going way back. This is the questions for Dan. You unpacked so much in such a short period of time, and maybe this is my mind making the connection, but what I was hearing you say was that there's no archaeological textual evidence for burials, including people who are bound. Mm-hmm. Were you suggesting then that John's intent with that was not to describe something necessarily literally, that was Lazarus' state, but that it communicated something and alluded to the broader cultural milieu of descending into Hades, or however you want to phrase that?
Yeah. I probably had too much on to try to present in the amount of time, so I appreciate the question, opportunity to clarify a couple things. So yeah, one is I'm convinced that John is doing something more in terms of characterizing Lazarus rather than offering a historical account of exactly what happened. And that's actually a reading of John that goes back quite a long ways to some of the ancient church fathers. Clement of Alexandria suggests we should treat this as the spiritual gospel, right, rather than one that's more concerned with literal facts. And so I do read it as a symbol, and as you noted, it's part of a broader cultural trope, we might say, where this image is associated sometimes with that crossing of boundaries between the terrestrial and the subterranean, right? So we see the references to Hades and Gehenna and stuff. But I'm not really confident that we can say, oh, Lazarus went to this such and such a place in the narrative. I'm more interested in the way that it's used more broadly to symbolize, to refer to this view that there is some sort of cosmic combat between the forces of life and death, between the forces of God and Satan in this gospel. And so in this gospel, you also remember that Satan enters into Judas before he betrays Jesus. When Jesus is talking to some of his opponents, he refers to them as children of the devil and says that he was a murderer from the beginning. So this demonic element of death runs through, and there's lots of concerns about that demonic language applied to the Jews in that gospel for good reason. But what I'm trying to identify is this motif of combat between life and death, and that by using this symbolic language, John is kind of portraying the raising of Lazarus as a loosing of him from the demonic bonds of death. So I'm not so concerned about saying, oh, he was in Hades or he was in Gehenna or wherever, but this idea that for John, which is often identified as the non-apocalyptic gospel and identified as the gospel that doesn't have any exorcisms compared to the Synoptic Gospels. There's actually a sort of exorcistic motif here, but it's associated with life and death rather than casting out of demons.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Another question?
I have a question for Eric. Do you ever consult with churches about how to get these things started?
No.
I have another question for Eric. Would you ever be willing to consult with churches about getting these started?
We'll have to talk more, but I'm trying to stay married.
Got it. I know your wife.
Eric, you're associated with the Second Presbyterian, I believe is what you said. Can you talk a little bit about the faith component of the program and just flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, so for Lego League in particular, in the middle of every single meeting, am I on?
Oh, are you?
Yeah, I think so. Sorry. Yeah, so in the middle of each of the meetings, we usually have a 15-minute Bible study, which is going to be during the snack time. So kids can't just stay focused for 2 hours, so we typically have about 45 minutes, then we go get snacks, which is why I mentioned the $400 in snacks each month. And then they come back, we'll usually have a lesson by the children's ministry director, and then they go back to the regular robotics programming for the rest of the remaining hour. Mikell just said, tell them how many are of another faith. So I would say probably 3/4 to 80% of the kids are of a non-Christian faith. And in fact, many of them are Hindu in particular. And you might think, oh, well, do those parents feel uncomfortable with it? In fact, a lot of the parents come for the lesson as well, because from their perspective, they're like, we want our kids and our family to know about the regional God that is here in the U.S. And so far from being threatened or bothered, they are very happy and appreciative that their kids get exposed to Christianity and the faith that we have here. And I'll also say this, the first event that we had ordered pizzas, right? And in a normal Presbyterian ministry, you're going to do probably 50% pepperoni, 25% sausage, and the last 25% cheese. Turns out the right balance was 90% veggie, 10% cheese, and so that's now what we have to order for pizza.
Another question, please.
This is for Renee, as we had a chance to talk last night. You talked about your mission trips, but would you mention a little bit about your ministry with the unhoused, that you had the Bible study and so forth?
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for that. So that was the one that I did not have a chance to talk about. It's the only local ministry that I did. And so I may have mentioned that I'm second career clergy. And so I was working for Turner Broadcasting, and my office was at the Inform building, which sits directly across from Centennial Olympic Park. And so my idea for my time during lunch was to study for our discipleship study for Wednesday night. So I'm busy doing that. And I sensed that God was saying to me, impressed on me, look around at them. When I looked around, I noticed that there was a large group of unhoused people sitting around doing various things. And someone came over to the table and said, are you going to teach Bible study? And so I'm thinking, okay, Lord, what's going on here? So I was kind of frightened by the idea, and I'm thinking, no, I don't think God is telling me to do this. So I go to walk away and go back to my office, and I happened to notice that one guy seemed to be looking at his Bible on his lap, and like he was ashamed to study. And this boldness came over me, and I just walked up to him and said, I study my Bible at lunchtime. Would you like to study with me? And he smiled, and that was a paradigm shift, because never, ever would I have approached an unhoused person for fear. So, I go back to my office, and I pray and pray in the evening, Lord, if this is what you're saying, let me know. So I come back, and one guy who happened to be one who met with us for 8 months walked over And it was the beginning of a midday Bible study that grew from one person to, I think it was like 15. I'd look out my office window and they're lined up on the bench, waiting for Bible study. But the most exciting part of it was the first guy that I met with, God allowed me to see him transformed. The day that I saw him first and the day that I saw him last, he was a totally different person. And one thing that he had shared with me was he wanted to work, he wanted to return to school, but he had one simple problem. He had no address, no means of getting his birth certificate or an ID. And so I asked, if you would trust me with your information, I will be your mailbox. And God took care of the rest for him. And it was one of the most powerful experiences that I could have had. It was one that facilitated my sense of God's calling to seminary and to something that had become more fulfilling than the time that I spent in corporate. So thank you.
Okay, we're at the end of our time. Let's give these folks a round of applause, and then if you don't mind hanging around if anyone has questions. Thank you all.